What would you do if you stumbled upon an unconscious stranger in the woods near your home? For Hanan and her mother, that question became reality on what started as an ordinary day. The morning sun filtered through the worn curtains of their small wooden house at the edge of town. Hanan stretched as she rose from her thin mattress, careful not to wake her mother who had worked late into the night mending clothes for extra income. Their home was modest, just 2 rooms with basic furnishings, but meticulously clean. Photographs in simple frames lined their single shelf, memories of happier times before Hanyan's father had accumulated gambling debts that now hung over their heads like a constant storm cloud. "Mom, I'm going to gather some mushrooms in the woods," Hanan called softly as her mother finally stirred. "The market vendor said he'd pay extra for the red-capped ones after yesterday's rain." Her mother nodded wearily, dark circles under her eyes, testament to her exhaustion. "Be careful. Don't go too deep into the forest." The concern in her voice reflected their reality. They couldn't afford even minor emergencies. With a woven basket looped over her arm, Hanan followed the familiar dirt path into the woods. Despite their struggles, she found peace among the trees, where financial worries seemed distant. The forest was unusually quiet that morning, the typical chorus of birds, strangely absent. As she ventured further in search of mushrooms, something caught her eye, an unusual glint of light reflecting off metal where the path curved ahead. Hanan approached cautiously, her breath catching in her throat at what she discovered. A man lay unconscious on the ground, blood trickling from a wound on his temple. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, dressed in clothes that immediately signaled wealth. A tailored suit, now torn and muddied. Italian leather shoes worth more than her family earned in months. "Sir, can you hear me?" she called, kneeling beside him. No response. Her fingers trembled as she checked for a pulse, relief washing over her when she felt the steady rhythm beneath her fingertips. Around his neck hung an intricately designed platinum pendant, with what appeared to be a rare blue diamond at its center. The jewelry alone could solve all her family's financial problems in an instant. For a fleeting moment, Hanan considered the possibility. One quick movement, and the necklace could disappear into her pocket. No one would know. The thought lingered for barely a second before shame overcame her. Whatever troubles her family faced, her mother had raised her with an unshakable moral compass. Instead, Hanan ran home faster than she'd ever moved before, bursting through the door breathlessly. "Mom, there's an injured man in the woods. He needs help." Her mother's face paled. "Did you check if he's alive? Should we call someone?" "He's breathing, but unconscious. He looks wealthy, maybe from the city." Hanan grabbed their only clean blanket. "We have to help him." Together they rushed back to where the man lay undisturbed. As Hanyan's mother examined him more closely, her expression grew troubled. "No identification, no wallet, just this expensive necklace. Someone might have robbed him. Look at the sole of his shoes," Hanan pointed. "They're barely scuffed. He hasn't walked far through these woods." Half a mile further, they discovered the evidence confirming her theory. A luxury car had veered off the narrow road and crashed into a tree. The driver's door hung open, the airbag deployed, but the vehicle was otherwise empty. The man had apparently wandered away from the crash site before collapsing. With considerable effort, they managed to help the unconscious stranger back to their home, Hanan supporting his shoulders while her mother held his legs. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. His manicured hands against their calloused ones, his tailored suit against their patched clothing. "We should call the hospital," Hanyan's mother said firmly, despite knowing the financial implications of what she was suggesting. "He needs proper medical care." Hanan nodded. Their only neighbor with a reliable vehicle was Mr. Chen, a grumpy man who charged exorbitant fees for rides into town. The cost would mean no food for days, but there was no alternative. As they waited for Mr. Chen to prepare his car, Hanan cleaned the wound on the stranger's head with their limited first aid supplies. His features were refined, his skin unmarked by physical labor. Who was he? Why was someone so obviously wealthy driving alone on their remote country road? Miles away, in a palatial estate in the city, panic was spreading. Yinan, sole heir to the Jinyu Tang Empire, had missed an essential board meeting. His father, stern and practical, was annoyed. His mother, intuitive and worried, sensed something wrong. Hanan had never been irresponsible with family business. When calls to his cell phone went unanswered hour after hour, irritation transformed into genuine concern. "Send security to track his car," his father finally ordered, pride giving way to fear. He left last night for that countryside winery inspection. He should have been back by dawn. Back in the small hospital on the outskirts of town, Hanan paced the worn linoleum floor of the waiting room. Her mother had used their emergency savings to pay the initial registration fee, but the doctor had already warned them more expenses would follow. "The CT scan shows no severe brain trauma," the doctor explained when he finally emerged from the examination room. "But I'm concerned about his cognitive function. He's experiencing retrograde amnesia, memory loss of events before the injury. He cannot tell us his name or any personal details." Hanyan's stomach tightened. "Will he recover?" "Possibly. Such cases vary widely. Some patients regain memory in days, others weeks or months. Some ... The doctor hesitated. "Some never fully recover their past." Just then, a nurse interrupted. "Doctor, the patient is awake and becoming agitated. He's asking where he is and who brought him here." Hanan and her mother exchanged glances. They had done what compassion demanded, but now faced an impossible situation. A wealthy stranger with no memory, no identification, and escalating medical bills that would soon exceed their capabilities. "We should go in," Hanyan's mother said softly. "He must be frightened." As they entered the hospital room, Hanan felt an unexpected flutter in her chest when the stranger's eyes met hers. Dark, confused, but somehow still commanding even in his vulnerability. The monitors beeped steadily as he studied them with open suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his refined accent confirming Hanyan's assumptions about his background. "What happened to me?" Hanan stepped forward. "I found you unconscious in the woods near our home. You had an accident. Your car crashed. We brought you here for help." His fingers instinctively reached for the platinum necklace still around his neck, seemingly the only thing familiar to him. "I don't remember anything," he whispered, fear breaking through his composed facade. "Not the accident, not my name, not why I was there." The doctor nodded gravely. "Classic retrograde amnesia. We'll need to run more tests, and meanwhile, we'll need contact information for billing purposes." The stranger's expression hardened. "I have no contacts to give you because I don't know who I am." His voice rose with each word, panic edging in. "I don't know who to call. I don't know where I live. I don't know anything." The panic in his voice echoed through the sterile hospital room as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. "I don't know who I am." Those 5 words hung in the air, carrying a weight few of us will ever comprehend. For this man, this stranger, existence had suddenly been reduced to a moment-by-moment experience with no foundation to stand on. The hospital staff exchanged skeptical glances as they observed his refined posture and articulate speech. How could someone so obviously educated and well-mannered truly remember nothing? Yet the fear in his eyes was unmistakably genuine. This wasn't a convenient lapse of memory. It was the terrifying void of a life completely erased. "Sir, we need your insurance information and identification," the nurse said firmly, clipboard in hand. "Hospital policy requires payment information before we can proceed with additional treatment." He stared at her blankly, then frantically patted his pockets, finding nothing. "I told you, I don't know who I am." His voice cracked as the panic escalated. "How can I give you identification when I don't even know my own name?" The hospital administrator was summoned, her expression hardening as she explained the situation. "Without identification or someone to vouch for you, we cannot continue care beyond emergency stabilization. Do you have any relatives we can contact? Anyone at all?" Hanan watched from the doorway as the man's face crumpled in desperation. Each question fired at him seemed to deepen his distress. The fundamental markers of identity most people take for granted, name, address, family, were completely inaccessible to him. He was adrift in a world that demanded answers he simply couldn't provide. "Perhaps you're experiencing temporary confusion from the accident," suggested a doctor, his tone carrying a hint of doubt. "Your speech patterns and mannerisms suggest education and refinement. Someone must be looking for you." The stranger's hands trembled as he gripped the bed rails. "If that's true, I have no way to reach them. I can't remember a single phone number, address, or name. It's all gone." Hanan stepped forward, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I'll help with the immediate hospital costs," she announced, fingering the expensive ring she'd removed from his hand while he was unconscious. She'd noticed its quality immediately, guessing it would cover at least the basic fees. It felt like a violation to sell his possession, but what choice did they have? The administrator nodded curtly. "That would be acceptable for now. But what happens when he's discharged? He can't simply wander the streets." Hanan hadn't considered that. Where would this man go? The question followed her home that evening, where her family gathered around their small dinner table to discuss the extraordinary situation. "This is madness," her father insisted, slamming his palm against the table. "We barely have enough to feed ourselves. Now you want to take responsibility for a complete stranger? But he has no one else," Hanan argued. "You didn't see his face, the fear in his eyes." "What if he's dangerous?" her father countered. "What if this memory loss is an act to gain our sympathy?" Her mother thoughtfully sipped her tea. "His clothes and jewelry suggest money. Perhaps there's a reward for finding him. Or perhaps there's a reason he was left unconscious in the woods," her father muttered darkly. Hanan couldn't shake the image of the stranger's desperate expression. "If we don't help him, who will? We found him. Doesn't that make him our responsibility in some way?" The debate continued late into the night, voices rising and falling as practical concerns battled with moral obligations. No consensus was reached when Hanan finally retired to bed, her thoughts churning with uncertainty. The next day at the hospital, the tension was palpable. The stranger sat on the edge of his bed, fully dressed in the clothes he'd been found in, expensive but now disheveled attire that seemed at odds with his current predicament. "The doctor says you're physically fine to be discharged," the nurse informed him briskly. "Do you have somewhere to go?" His silence answered the question. Where could a man with no identity possibly go? Hanan stepped forward again, making a decision that would alter multiple lives forever. "He can come with us, just until he remembers something or someone comes looking for him." The stranger looked up, his expression a mixture of gratitude and shame. "I can't impose on you like that. You've already done too much. Would you rather sleep on the street?" Hanan asked practically. "Because those seem to be your options right now." His shoulders slumped in defeat. What choice did he have? In that moment, the reality of his complete dependence on these strangers crystallized. He had no alternative, no backup plan, no resources of his own. The psychological weight of such vulnerability was crushing. When Hanyan's mother arrived to help with the discharge process, she studied the stranger with cautious kindness. "We need to call you something," she said finally, "until you remember your real name. How about we call you Big Guy?" It was simple, even slightly humorous, but the nickname represented something profound, his first stepping stone toward a new identity. His eyes welled with unexpected emotion at this small kindness. "Thank you," he whispered, the words inadequate for the lifeline they had thrown him. The discharge paperwork listed him simply as John Doe, the universal placeholder for the unknown. As the hospital doors closed behind them, Big Guy stepped into a world that felt entirely new. A world where he would have to rebuild himself from scratch. The drive to Hanyan's home was quiet, the passenger staring intently out the window, as if hoping something, anything, might trigger a memory. The modest neighborhood gave way to increasingly rural surroundings, a far cry from the luxury suggested by his attire. When they arrived at the small wooden house, Big Guy paused at the threshold, a strange sense of disconnect washing over him. Something deep inside whispered that this wasn't his world, yet it was now his only refuge. The contrast between his refined speech patterns and this humble setting created an odd dissonance that no one could ignore. "It's not much," Hanan apologized, suddenly self-conscious about their home. "It's everything," he replied simply, understanding that this shelter represented far more than just physical protection. It was the beginning of his journey back to personhood. That night, lying on a makeshift bed in their cramped living area, Big Guy stared at the ceiling, trying desperately to grasp at the fragments of dreams that felt almost like memories. The anxiety of identity loss kept sleep at bay. Who was waiting for him somewhere? Did he have family searching desperately? A career abandoned? Responsibilities neglected? The questions haunted him, each one underscoring the profound existential crisis of his situation. For most people, identity is a given, a stable foundation built from memories, relationships, and experiences. For Big Guy, that foundation had been obliterated, leaving him to construct a new self in real time, without blueprints or materials. The psychological vertigo was overwhelming. That overwhelming psychological vertigo became even more pronounced the next morning, when Big Guy faced his first real test, proving his worth to a family already struggling to survive. Standing in Hanan's kitchen, he stared at a simple pot of rice, with the bewilderment of a child, facing advanced calculus. His hands, though manicured and strong, fumbled with the most basic kitchen tools. "I don't understand why I can't do this," he muttered, frustration etching lines across his forehead as he dropped a spoon for the third time. Hanan watched from the doorway, her expression a mix of sympathy and amusement. "Some things take practice," she offered, stepping forward to demonstrate the proper way to serve the morning meal. "Even if you were a master chef before, your muscles need to relearn what your mind has forgotten." The awkwardness of these moments hung heavy in the air, especially when Hanan's father returned from his early morning errands. His narrowed eyes followed Big Guy's every movement, suspicion radiating from him in palpable waves. "Another mouth to feed," he grumbled to his wife later that afternoon, not bothering to lower his voice as Big Guy sat nearby. "We can barely keep ourselves afloat, and now we're taking in strays." The words stung, but they also ignited something in Big Guy, a determination that surprised even him. That evening, as Hanan prepared to close their modest corn stall in the local market, he approached her with unexpected resolve. "Let me help with the business," he said, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. "I need to contribute if I'm going to stay with your family." Hanan's laugh was gentle but skeptical. "You want to sell grilled corn? Have you ever cooked anything in your life?" "I don't know," he admitted, the painful truth of his condition laid bare in those 3 simple words. "But I can learn." The next morning brought the first of many impromptu cooking lessons. The small charcoal grill seemed to mock Big Guy, as Hanan demonstrated how to arrange the corn, how to monitor the heat, and when to turn each ear for perfect caramelization. "See how the kernels change color? That's when you know," she explained, taking his hand to guide him through the motion of rotating the corn. The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through him that had nothing to do with the grill's heat. "From today, you can call me Master Han," she teased, striking a pose of exaggerated authority that made them both collapse into laughter. The learning curve was steep. Big Guy burned his fingers repeatedly, charred perfectly good corn beyond recognition, and on one memorable occasion nearly set his sleeve on fire. Yet with each failure came improvement. His hands grew more confident, developing calluses where smooth skin had once been. "You're holding that like you're afraid it might bite you," Hanan observed on the 3rd day, watching him gingerly turn an ear of corn. "It's food, not a venomous snake." What began as an exercise in basic survival skills gradually transformed into something more significant. Working side by side with Hanan at the market stall, Big Guy discovered an easy companionship that felt both new and strangely familiar. Their conversations flowed naturally, punctuated by shared jokes and observations about the colorful market customers. "You don't seem like someone who's ever had to work for anything," Hanan remarked one afternoon, watching him struggle with making change for a customer. "Your hands are too soft." Big Guy looked down at his palms, already beginning to toughen from the work. "Whatever I was before, this is who I am now." A week into their new arrangement, something unexpected happened. A businessman from a neighboring town stopped by their stall, complaining that his car had broken down and he needed to deliver important documents. "I can drive you," Big Guy offered before he could stop himself. Both Hanan and the businessman looked at him with surprise. "You know how to drive?" Hanan asked. The truth was, Big Guy didn't know if he could drive until he sat behind the wheel. His hands instinctively found the correct position, his feet working the pedals with practiced ease. The businessman watched with growing amazement as Big Guy navigated the unfamiliar roads with the confidence of a professional driver. "You sure you don't remember who you are?" the man asked when they reached their destination. "You drive like someone who's spent a lifetime behind the wheel of luxury vehicles." This incident was the first in a series of revelations. Certain skills remained intact in Big Guy's muscle memory, suggesting a life far different from his current circumstances. Yet rather than dwelling on these mysteries, he channeled his energy into mastering his new role. By the third week, something remarkable began to happen. Big Guy wasn't just competently grilling corn, he was thriving at it. His natural charisma drew customers to their stall, his easy smile and attentive service ensuring they returned. He developed a knack for remembering regular customers' preferences and engaging them in conversation that made each sale feel personal. 2 ears with extra chili for Mr. Zhang, he'd call out, already preparing the order as the elderly man approached. How did your grandson's examination go? Hanan watched this transformation with growing admiration. You're better at this than I am, she admitted one evening, as they counted their earnings, noticeably higher than their usual take. It's like you were born to sell things to people. Working together created a rhythm to their days that felt comforting in its predictability. Morning preparation, the busy lunch rush, afternoon lulls filled with conversation, and evening cleanup became the framework around which Big Guy built his new identity. The market stall became a stage where he could perform this new version of himself with growing confidence. Even Han Yan's skeptical mother began to warm to him as his contributions to the household became undeniable. Their increased earnings helped ease the constant financial pressure that had been strangling the family. You've been good for business, she acknowledged grudgingly one evening, sliding an extra portion of food onto his plate at dinner. The simple gesture spoke volumes about his growing acceptance. As the weeks passed, Big Guy settled into this new life with surprising ease. The small wooden house no longer felt foreign, the daily routines of market life no longer overwhelming. He learned the names of regular customers, memorized the shortcuts through the market stalls, and even began experimenting with new corn seasonings that proved popular. Yet beneath this growing comfort lay persistent questions. Occasional headaches would strike without warning, bringing flashes of unfamiliar images. A spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows, the interior of an expensive car, a fountain pen signing documents. These moments left him disoriented and strangely melancholy. Does anything ever feel familiar to you? Hanan asked one evening as they walked home from the market. Like you almost remember something but can't quite grasp it? Big Guy paused, considering the question carefully. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, he admitted. But then I realized this is the only life I know for certain. Everything else could be imagination. Hanan studied his face in the fading light. Maybe who you were before doesn't matter as much as who you're becoming now. Tukusai. Those simple words about becoming someone new echoed with an irony neither of them could comprehend. Across town, in a mansion 20 times the size of Hanyan's modest home, Wang Liwei slammed his fist on a mahogany desk worth more than everything Big Guy and Hanan would earn in 5 years. Find my son, he demanded, or there won't be a company left for him to inherit. The Jinyutang winery stood as more than just a business. For generations, the Wang family had cultivated not just exquisite wines, but a legacy that represented China's finest traditions. Their bottles graced the tables of diplomats and executives across Asia. The company's headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper of glass and steel in downtown Beijing, now felt like a mausoleum without its heir. It's been 3 weeks, Mr. Wang, the private investigator said, sliding photographs across the polished desk. We've followed every lead from the accident site. The car was empty when your security team found it. Then look harder. Wang's voice echoed through the cavernous office. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a sprawling cityscape that seemed small compared to his influence. Increase the search radius. Hire more investigators. I want every hospital, every police station, every village within 100 miles checked again. While Big Guy stood at a humble market stall perfecting his corn grilling technique, an empire was crumbling. Board meetings at Jinyutang had devolved into power struggles. The company's ambitious expansion into international markets, a plan Yinan had spearheaded before his disappearance, now hung in limbo. In the executive conference room, Liu Xiang, the company's ambitious CFO, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should consider continuing with the international expansion without waiting for Yinan's return. I've taken the liberty of reviewing his proposals and have several improvements in mind. Wang Liwei's eyes narrowed. My son's plans remain his plans. Nothing proceeds until he returns. The tension in the room was palpable. Every executive knew what was happening. Liu Xiang was positioning himself as the alternative to the missing heir. It wasn't just opportunism, it was tradition. In the cutthroat world of Chinese family businesses, succession was everything. Without Hanan, the Wang dynasty faced an existential threat. Back at the Wang family estate, a sprawling compound with gardens designed by the same architect who had restored sections of the Forbidden City, Hanan's mother sat alone in her son's untouched bedroom. Unlike her husband, Madame Wang's concerns weren't primarily about business implications. Her fingers traced the frame of a photograph showing her son at his university graduation. He wouldn't just leave, she whispered to the empty room. Something must have happened to him. The contrast between the two worlds Hanan now inhabited couldn't have been more striking. In one, crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and staff moved silently through hallways adorned with priceless art. In the other, a single bare bulb illuminated Hanyan's kitchen as her family shared humble meals at a wooden table scarred by years of use. Yet it was at that scarred table where Hanan, now known only as Big Guy, found himself truly laughing for the first time in years. He didn't remember his previous life, but something in him recognized the authenticity of these moments. With the Wang family, meals had been formal affairs, often doubling as business meetings. Here, food was accompanied by stories, jokes, and genuine warmth. The investigators have a new lead, Wang Liwei told his wife later that week. They traced the ring. Madame Wang looked up sharply. Hanan's ring? The one from his grandfather? The ring, a platinum band with the family crest, had been passed down for generations. Investigators had discovered it had been sold to a jewelry dealer in a town near where Hanan's car had been found. They're checking security footage from the shop now, Wang Liwei said, his voice tight with hope and fear. If someone sold it, they might lead us to our son. Little did they know that the money from that very ring had paid for the hospital bills that saved their son's life, and bound him to Hanyan's family with an unspoken debt of gratitude. The investigation was narrowing, but Hanan remained blissfully unaware of his former identity. As days turned to weeks, he found himself settling into a routine that brought him satisfaction he never knew in his previous life. "We sold out again today," Hanan exclaimed, counting their earnings at the end of another successful market day. "Your special 5-spice corn is bringing people from 3 villages over now." Big Guy smiled, feeling a simple pride that was entirely new to him. In his previous life, success had been measured in millions, in market share, in boardroom victories. Now, it was the satisfied smile of a customer, the rhythmic turning of corn on the grill, the growing stack of small bills that would help Hanyan's family make it through another week. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that his father had scheduled a visit to this very market the following day. Wang Liwei had insisted on personally investigating every lead, including rumors of a new vendor who had appeared in the market around the same time his son had vanished. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Hanan and Big Guy set up their stall earlier than usual, hoping to catch the breakfast crowd. "Your corn smells magnificent," said an elegant older woman, stopping at their stall. Behind her, a driver in a black suit waited patiently. "2 portions, please." As Big Guy prepared her order, he felt a strange prickle at the back of his neck. A black luxury sedan had pulled up at the edge of the market, and a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit stepped out, flanked by 2 younger men in similar attire. "That's odd," Hanan whispered. "We don't usually see people like that here." The man, Wang Liwei himself, moved through the market with purpose, showing a photograph to vendors and speaking in low tones. He was less than 30 feet away when the woman at their stall called to him. "Liwei, come try this corn. It's exceptional." Wang Liwei glanced toward the voice, distracted by his search. "Later, perhaps. We have more stalls to check." And just like that, father and son stood mere yards apart, one searching desperately for what was right before his eyes, the other blissfully unaware of what he had lost. Wang Liwei moved on, the photograph of his son clutched in his hand, while Big Guy continued grilling corn, the smoke partially obscuring his face. That night, as Hanan and Big Guy walked home, she noticed he seemed quieter than usual. "Is everything all right?" she asked. He paused, looking up at the stars. I keep feeling like I'm forgetting something important. But then I think, does it even matter? I'm happier now than I can remember ever being. The irony of his words hung in the night air. The heir to a billion-dollar empire had found contentment selling corn from a market stall, living in a two-room house with a family struggling to make ends meet. Meanwhile, the magnificent home where he'd grown up sat empty, preserved like a museum exhibition, waiting for its central figure to return. As the investigators gradually worked their way closer to Hanan's village, following the trail of the sold ring and eyewitness accounts of a man matching Hanan's description, two worlds were set on an inevitable collision course. The only question was which world would Hanan choose when his memory eventually returned: the empire built by generations of his family, or the simple life that had finally taught him what happiness truly felt like. Memory has a strange way of asserting itself, like a river that refuses to be dammed. For Hanan, that river was beginning to break through the barriers of his amnesia in unexpected and disorienting ways. The fragments came without warning, striking him with the force of lightning. A hand, signing important documents, the purr of a luxury engine, faces at a boardroom table looking to him for direction. These weren't just random images. They carried emotional weight that left him breathless and confused, as if his brain was whispering secrets about a stranger who happened to share his body. The headaches began during a particularly busy market day. Hanan was in the middle of serving a customer when pain shot through his temples, bringing him to his knees. In that moment of agony, he saw himself seated at the head of a mahogany table, raising a crystal glass of ruby-red wine toward a room full of applauding executives. The vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him disoriented and gasping. "Are you okay?" Hanan was at his side immediately, her face etched with concern. "You went white as a sheet." Hanan touched his forehead, finding it slick with cold sweat. "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just got dizzy for a second." But it wasn't just a single incident. The headaches and flashes continued with increasing frequency over the following weeks. He'd be chopping vegetables and suddenly feel the weight of an expensive watch on his wrist. While bathing in the family's modest wooden tub, he'd recall the sensation of swimming in a private pool overlooking city lights. Each memory fragment left him more disturbed than the last, creating an unsettling disconnect between the simple life he'd grown to love and these glimpses of apparent privilege. "Your brain is fighting against itself," Hanan observed one evening after witnessing another episode. She'd noticed how he would sometimes freeze mid-conversation, his eyes focused on something only he could see. "It's like there are two different people trying to exist in one body." Her innocent observation was more accurate than she knew. These memory flashes were creating a profound identity crisis for Hanan. The skills and knowledge emerging from his subconscious suggested a life vastly different from selling corn with Hanan. He found himself instinctively reaching for non-existent cufflinks each morning. When a local businessman complained about market fluctuations, Hanan spouted analysis worthy of a financial expert before catching himself. The most revealing incident occurred during the village's annual harvest festival. A traveling wine merchant had set up a tasting booth, challenging visitors to identify different varieties for a small prize. Hanan had dragged Hanan over, thinking it would be entertaining to watch him stumble through the challenge. "Go on," she urged. "You can't possibly know anything about fancy wines." The merchant poured small amounts of 3 different wines into glasses and waited expectantly. Hanan lifted the first glass, swirled it absently, then inhaled its aroma. Something deep within his brain clicked into place, and his body moved on autopilot, examining the color against the light, taking a precise sip, letting it coat his tongue before spitting it into the provided bucket. "A Cabernet Sauvignon, approximately 5 years old, from Shandong province," he stated confidently. Notes of blackcurrant with a hint of cedar. The tannins suggest it was aged in French oak barrels. The wine merchant's jaw dropped. Hanan stared in disbelief. Hanan himself looked the most shocked of all. "How did you know that?" Hanan whispered as they walked away from the booth, Hanan clutching the small prize basket he'd won after correctly identifying all 3 wines. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice shaking. "It just came to me, like I've done it 1,000 times before." That night, alone on the small roof where he sometimes slept under the stars, Hanan confronted the growing suspicion that had been building within him. These weren't random skills or coincidences. He wasn't just some ordinary man who had wandered into the forest and lost his memory. The knowledge emerging from his subconscious, wine expertise, financial acumen, the comfort with luxury items, pointed to a past completely at odds with his present circumstances. Hanan found him there, staring at the pendant he always wore around his neck. The moonlight caught the blue stone at its center, making it glow with an inner fire. "You're remembering things, aren't you?" she asked, sitting beside him. There was fear in her voice that she couldn't quite disguise. "Pieces," he admitted. "Nothing coherent. Just fragments that don't fit together." He hesitated, then added, "Hanan, I don't think I belong here." The hurt that flashed across her face was immediately replaced with a forced smile. "Of course you do. You're part of our family now." But both knew he was speaking a deeper truth. Whatever his past contained, it wasn't aligned with this simple village life. The psychological defense mechanisms in his brain were weakening, allowing more memories to surface despite his resistance to them. "This pendant," he said, holding it up, "I think it's important. Not just to me, but valuable. I keep having dreams about it." Hanan studied the blue stone. She had noticed how he clutched it during his episodes, as if it were an anchor to his true self. "Maybe we should find out what it is," she suggested carefully. "There's a jewelry shop in the city. We could go there on market day." The jewelry shop was small, but reputable, tucked away on a side street in the nearest city. The owner, an elderly man with magnifying glasses perched permanently on his nose, took one look at Hanan's pendant and nearly dropped his tools. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice hushed with reverence. "It's mine," Hanan said defensively. "I've always had it." It was the only truth he knew for certain. The jeweler examined the stone under his strongest loupe, his hands trembling slightly. "This is no ordinary gemstone, young man. This is an extremely rare blue diamond, at least 15 carats, with exceptional clarity. Its value would be—" He trailed off, glancing nervously between them. "Well, let's just say you could buy half this city with it," Hanan gasped. Hanan felt the room spin around him as another memory surfaced. His father placing the pendant in his hands on his 25th birthday, saying words he couldn't quite hear in his memory. "Are you selling?" the jeweler asked hopefully. "No," Hanan replied instantly, clutching the pendant possessively. The thought of parting with it felt like contemplating cutting off a limb. On the bus ride home, Hanan was unusually quiet. Hanan knew what she was thinking. That this was further proof he came from a world of wealth and privilege, a world that would eventually reclaim him. The enormous value of his pendant made their humble existence seem even more temporary, a brief interlude before his real life called him back. What Hanan couldn't know was the internal war raging within Hanan. Each returning memory fragment threatened the peace and happiness he'd found with her family. The more he remembered about his apparent past life, the more he feared losing the simplicity and genuine connection he'd discovered in his present one. That night, as they walked home from the bus stop, Hanan finally spoke the fear that had been growing between them. "When you remember everything, you'll leave, won't you?" Hanan stopped, turning to face her under the glow of the village's single streetlight. Her eyes held the quiet resignation of someone preparing for inevitable loss. "I don't want to remember," he admitted. "Whoever I was before, he wasn't happy. I can feel that much. But here, with you and your family, I've found something real." In that moment, Hanan made a conscious decision that many with retrograde amnesia unconsciously make, to resist the full return of his memories. He would protect this new identity, this simple happiness, against the complicated past trying to reclaim him. The blue diamond pendant would remain around his neck, but he would stop seeking answers about its origin or his previous life. Sometimes the walls we build to protect our new identities are made of nothing more than wishful thinking. For Hanan, the sanctuary he'd created selling corn alongside Hanan was about to be tested in the most public way possible. The annual Marketplace Festival, an event that should have been just another workday, was destined to become the stage where his carefully constructed new life would begin unraveling thread by thread. The marketplace hummed with an energy that felt different from their usual selling days. Colorful banners stretched overhead, announcing special promotions while vendors called out their wares with renewed enthusiasm. Hanan and Hanan had secured a prime location for their corn stand, directly adjacent to an elaborate promotional booth, bearing the familiar Jinyutang logo. The wine company had erected an impressive display with polished bottles, arranged beneath soft lighting, creating an island of luxury amid the market's rustic charm. "We got lucky with this spot," Hanan remarked, adjusting her apron. "All these wine tasters will need something substantial afterward." Hanan nodded, but his attention kept drifting to the Jinyutang booth, where elegantly dressed staff poured precise measurements of amber and ruby liquids into crystal glasses. The practiced movements of the sommelier triggered something in him, a distant familiarity he couldn't place. A woman in a tailored business suit supervised the setup, her commanding presence drawing respectful nods from her staff. This was Liu Kaifan, the company's marketing director, though Hanan had no way of knowing this yet. She caught him staring and offered a professional smile before returning to her clipboard. The morning progressed smoothly until mid-afternoon, when a sleek black car pulled up at the market's entrance. From it emerged an older woman wearing expensive jade jewelry, her posture rigid with authority. Mrs. Tang Huimin, mother-in-law to the current CEO of Jinyutang, had arrived to observe the promotional event personally. Her assistant hurried alongside her, umbrella poised to shield her from the sun. What happened next occurred with the sudden intensity of a summer storm. Mrs. Tang's casual glance across the marketplace landed on Hanan. Her composed expression shattered, replaced by shock so profound that she stumbled mid-step. "You ping." The name escaped her lips as barely a whisper, then escalated to a piercing scream. "You ping." The crowd parted as Mrs. Tang rushed forward, her eyes never leaving Hanyan's confused face. Before anyone could react, the older woman had grasped Hanyan's shoulders, her fingers digging in with desperate intensity. "My daughter, where have you been all these years? Look at you, working at a market stall. What happened to you?" Hanyan's confusion quickly turned to alarm. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm not Yuping. My name is Hanan." But Mrs. Tang wouldn't be dissuaded. "No, no. I would know my daughter's face anywhere. These eyes, they're exactly like your father's." Her voice cracked with emotion as she tried to touch Hanyan's cheek. Hanan stepped forward protectively. "There's been a mistake. She's not who you think she is." By now a crowd had gathered, marketplace patrons forming a curious circle around the unfolding drama. Staff from the Jinyutang booth abandoned their posts to assist their executive's mother-in-law, Liu Kaifan, hurrying to the forefront. "Mrs. Tang, please, you're causing a scene," Liu Kaifan said softly, attempting to guide the older woman away. "How dare you?" Mrs. Tang's voice rose. "This is my daughter who disappeared 15 years ago. Look at her face." The commotion attracted unwanted attention from a group of young men who had been drinking at a nearby stall. Seeing the prestigious Jinyutang display momentarily unattended, they seized the opportunity. One of them deliberately knocked into the table, sending several wine bottles crashing to the ground. "Oops," one sneered. "Guess your fancy wine isn't so special after all." Another reached for an unopened bottle. "Maybe we should sample some for ourselves." What happened next occurred so quickly that, later, witnesses would give conflicting accounts. Hanan moved with precision that seemed impossible for a corn vendor. In 3 fluid movements, he had intercepted the troublemaker, twisted the bottle from his grasp, and positioned himself between the vandals and the display. "I suggest you leave," Hanan said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the marketplace. His stance wasn't that of someone looking for a fight. It was the confident posture of someone who knew exactly how to end one. The would-be thieves hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Something in Hanan's eyes, a cold calculation that hadn't been there moments before, made them reconsider. They backed away, muttering threats but ultimately disappearing into the crowd. The entire incident took less than 30 seconds, but it transformed how everyone present saw Hanan. No longer the simple corn seller, he stood revealed as something else entirely. Though what exactly, no one could say. Liu Kaifan approached him first. "That was impressive. Where did you learn to handle yourself like that?" Hanan's expression showed genuine confusion. I don't know. It just happened." The marketplace gradually returned to its normal rhythm. But the atmosphere around their corn stand had fundamentally changed. Hanan kept glancing at Yinan with newfound uncertainty, while Mrs. Tang had been escorted back to her vehicle, still insisting that Hanan was her long-lost daughter. As they closed their stand that evening, Liu Kaifan approached again, this time with a business card extended toward Yinan. "We could use someone with your instincts at Jinyutang. I need an assistant who can think quickly and handle difficult situations. The position comes with excellent compensation." Yinan took the card mechanically, nodding his thanks without committing to anything. The walk home with Han Yan was unnaturally quiet, both lost in thoughts about what had transpired. "Are you considering it?" Han Yan finally asked as they approached her family's house. "I don't know," Yinan admitted. "It feels strange." "Strange how?" He struggled to articulate the feeling. "Like I've been offered this kind of position before. The card, the formal interview request, it all seems familiar somehow." Han Yan stopped walking. "Do you think this might help you remember who you are?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to face. If Yinan recovered his memories, what would happen to their simple life together? "Maybe," he said softly, "but I'm not sure I want to remember anymore. I like our life." Han Yan's eyes reflected a complex mixture of emotions, hope that he would stay, fear that he wouldn't, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. The decision might have remained theoretical if not for what happened the following morning. Han Yan's mother sat them down at breakfast, her expression grave. "Your father's creditors came by last night," she told Han Yan. "They're demanding payment in full by the end of the month, or they'll take the house." The sum she named made Han Yan pale. "That's more than we make in 3 months, even on our best days." Yinan stared at the business card he'd been turning over in his hands. The salary Liu Kaifan had mentioned casually would cover the debt, with room to spare. In that moment, his decision crystallized, not from any pull toward his old life, but from devotion to his new one. "I'll take the job," he said simply. 2 days later, Yinan stood at the entrance to the Jinyutang corporate headquarters, dressed in the best clothes Han Yan's family could provide. The security guard waved him through as if he belonged there, and as the elevator carried him upward, a strange sensation washed over him. The polished brass railings, the subtle aroma of sandalwood in the air, the hushed conversations, all triggered a sense of déjà vu so powerful it almost made him dizzy. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Yinan stepped out with a confidence he didn't consciously possess. His feet carried him unerringly toward the marketing department, as if some part of him had walked this path countless times before. The human mind can forget, but muscle memory rarely lies. Yinan's body moved through Jinyutang's hallways, with the practiced ease of someone returning home, even as his conscious mind remained a stranger to these gleaming corridors, setting the stage for a precarious double life, where one wrong step could collapse everything. Each morning, Yinan left the modest wooden home before dawn, exchanging his worn cotton clothes for the crisp suit that hung in the employee locker room at Jinyutang. By evening, he'd reverse the transformation, sliding back into his simpler garments before returning to Han Yan's family. This daily metamorphosis wasn't just about clothing, it was about identity itself. "Executive assistants in our company aren't just administrative staff," Liu Kaifan explained during his first week, her manicured hand lingering on his shoulder longer than necessary. "They're extensions of the executives themselves. My right hand, if you will." Yinan nodded, trying to ignore the strange familiarity he felt with the marketing reports spread across the polished mahogany table. The data made sense to him, too much sense. When Liu Kaifan asked his opinion on a new vineyard acquisition, his analysis flowed naturally, as if he'd been evaluating wine markets for years. "That's remarkably insightful," she said, studying him with newfound interest. "Where did you learn to read profit margins like that?" "I'm not sure," he answered truthfully. "It just makes sense to me." The pattern repeated itself throughout his first month. When discussing distribution channels, Yinan instinctively knew which questions to ask. During a tour of the office, he found himself walking toward the executive bathroom without being directed. In meetings, technical terms that should have confused him instead felt like old friends. Meanwhile, Liu Kaifan's professional interest was clearly evolving into personal attraction. She invited him to late meetings that mysteriously transformed into private dinners. Her touches became more frequent, adjusting his tie, brushing imaginary lint from his shoulder, letting her fingers graze his when passing documents. "My grandfather wants to meet you," she announced one afternoon, surprising him. "He rarely takes interest in new employees, but he's heard about your unusual aptitude." Hanan struggled to maintain his composure. The chairman of Jinyu Tang wanting to meet an assistant? It felt both flattering and dangerous, like stepping closer to a truth he wasn't ready to confront. Back in Hanyan's village, he faced an entirely different challenge. His first paycheck had been substantial, more than Hanyan's family typically saw in months. That night, he'd slipped half of it under their rice container, telling Hanan the next morning that he'd found it while cleaning. "That's impossible," she'd argued, eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Who would leave this much money in our home? Maybe your father sold something valuable?" he suggested, hating the deception but seeing no alternative. The class divide between his two worlds became increasingly apparent. At Jinyu Tang, executives discussed weekend trips to Paris as casually as Hanyan's neighbors talked about visiting the next village. In one world, a bottle of wine cost more than a month's expenses in the other. "You seem different lately," Hanan observed one evening as they walked home from the market. They still maintained their corn stand on weekends, Hanan's insistence, despite his growing exhaustion. More confident, but also distant. The guilt was crushing him. Each morning at Jinyu Tang, he felt more at home among the corporate elite. Each evening with Hanan, he was reminded of the simple joy that had sustained him during his amnesia. He was becoming a man divided against himself. The breaking point came after his meeting with Chairman Liu, a shrewd octogenarian whose penetrating gaze seemed to strip away Hanan's carefully constructed facade. "There's something about you," the chairman said, studying Hanan over steepled fingers. "Something familiar. Have we met before your employment here?" "I don't believe so, sir," Hanan replied, heart pounding. The old man's eyes narrowed. "You remind me of someone. The way you analyze problems, very reminiscent of an old colleague." That same evening, Liu Kaifan invited Hanan to her office after hours. The marketing department was empty, the lights of Beijing twinkling through floor-to-ceiling windows. On her desk sat a small velvet box. "I have something for you," she said, sliding the box toward him. Inside was a watch, platinum with a sapphire face, the kind that cost more than most cars. "I can't accept this," he said immediately, recognizing its value despite himself. "Of course you can," she insisted, stepping closer. "Hanan, surely you must realize by now that my interest in you extends beyond your work performance." The use of his name, his actual name, not big guy, jolted him. He'd given Jinyu Tang his real name because the amnesia story would have been too complicated for employment papers, but hearing it from her lips sounded wrong. "You're extraordinary," she continued, moving into his personal space. "The way you understand our business, your insights, it's like you were born for this world. My grandfather agrees. He sees potential in you that goes far beyond an assistant position." Her hand touched his face, and he felt frozen between impulses, to step away or to lean in. This woman represented everything about his new life: power, wealth, opportunity. Yet all he could think about was Hanyan's smile when they'd sold their first batch of corn together. "I think we could be magnificent together," Liu Kaifan whispered, her lips now inches from his. The moment stretched between them. In her eyes, he saw a future laid out: executive positions, wealth, influence, everything a man should want, everything he might have wanted before. "I'm flattered," he finally said, gently stepping back. "But there are complications in my life right now." Her expression hardened slightly. "The girl from the market? Your roommate?" The way she said it made his blood run cold. How much did she know about his double life? Had someone been watching him? "My personal arrangements are temporary," he said carefully, "but they're important to me." "I see." Her tone was professional again, though her eyes remained calculating. "Take some time to consider your priorities, Hanan. Opportunities like this, like us, don't come along often." Later that night, after declining her dinner invitation, Hanan stood alone in the darkened marketing department. The city lights reflected in the window glass, superimposing his image over the urban landscape below. In the reflection, he saw two men, one in an expensive suit, hair perfectly styled, standing in a modern office tower. And behind that image, like a shadow, a simpler man with calloused hands who sold corn at a village market. In the world of Chinese elite families, a sudden engagement announcement isn't just a personal affair. It's a public declaration of alliance between powerful dynasties. When Liu Kaifan's grandfather stood before the assembled executives at the quarterly Jinyutang board meeting and proudly announced his granddaughter's engagement to their promising new marketing assistant, Hanan felt the floor vanish beneath him. No proposal had been made, no agreement reached, yet there it was, his future, determined without his consent, announced to applause and congratulations, while he stood frozen in shock. In wealthy Chinese families, arranged marriages are often seen as strategic alliances that can enhance business interests and social status. Liu Kaifan had once explained to him when discussing a colleague's wedding. Now those words returned with devastating clarity as he realized he had become the subject of such an arrangement. The board members approached with handshakes and backslaps, while Liu Kaifan beamed beside her grandfather, the perfect picture of a dutiful granddaughter fulfilling family expectations. That evening, Yinan's hands trembled as he opened the door to Hanyan's family home. The contrast between the gleaming corporate headquarters he'd left and the humble wooden structure before him had never felt more stark. How could he explain what had happened? The words caught in his throat as Hanan looked up from the kitchen table, her smile fading as she registered his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down the knife she'd been using to prepare vegetables. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The truth spilled out in halting sentences. With each word, he watched something in Hanyan's eyes dim, though she maintained a brave smile. When he finished, the silence between them stretched painfully until she finally spoke. "You should be proud," she said softly. "The marketing director of Jinyutang wants to marry you. That's wonderful." But her voice cracked on the final word, betraying the emotion she struggled to conceal. Hanyan's mother, overhearing from the doorway, entered with a decisive step. Rather than anger or disappointment, her face showed only maternal concern, not for her daughter's heartbreak, but for Yinan's predicament. "A man should have something special to give his bride," she declared, sliding a simple gold band from her finger, a ring worn thin by decades of hard work. "It's not much compared to what she can give you, but it has love in it." She pressed it into his palm. "It brought me luck. Perhaps it will bring you some too." The weight of the modest ring felt heavier than any burden Hanan had ever carried. These people who had taken him in when he had nothing were now giving him their treasures to support a marriage that would permanently separate him from them. The concept of duty versus personal happiness tore at him, creating an internal battle that left him sleepless through the night. Over the following days, preparations for the engagement accelerated. Liu Kaifan, mistaking his quiet distress for shyness, took command of the arrangements. She introduced him to wedding planners, florists, and venue coordinators, each more expensive than the last. Each evening, Hanan returned to Hanyan's home, the gap between his worlds widening with every sunset. "Why do you still come back here?" Hanan asked him one evening as they sat on the porch steps. "You could stay in the city. It would be easier. This is the only place that feels real," he admitted. The truth was simpler and more complex than he could express. Being near her had become essential to his sense of self. The emotional turmoil intensified when Hanan suggested they visit the woods, where she had found him months ago. "Before you begin your new life," she said, "maybe seeing where it all started will help you find peace with it ending." The forest path felt familiar now, though Hanan had no memory of his first journey through it. As they reached the clearing where Hanan had discovered him unconscious, something shifted in the atmosphere between them. Standing in that sacred space where one life had ended and another begun, words no longer seemed necessary. Hanan turned to him, eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. "I need to tell you something," she began. "When I found you here, A sudden screech of tires interrupted her. They had wandered near the road that curved around the forest's edge. A delivery truck had swerved to avoid a fallen branch, careening toward the shoulder where Hanan stood. Yinan's body moved before his mind could process what was happening. He lunged forward, wrapping his arms around Hanan and rolling them both away from the vehicle's path. The impact of his body hitting the ground triggered something profound, like a dam breaking in his mind. Images flooded his consciousness. Boardroom meetings, family dinners in a mansion, arguments with his father about company direction, the winery inspection on the day of his accident, the sudden downpour that caused him to lose control of his car. Hanan gasped, clutching his head as his full identity reassembled itself in a rush of memory. The psychological studies were right. The emotional turmoil was overwhelming. Names, faces, responsibilities, and expectations crashed through his consciousness with unstoppable force. "Hanan?" Hanyan's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you hurt?" He looked at her, truly seeing her as both the woman who had saved his life and the woman he had grown to love. With full awareness of who he was. "I remember," he whispered. "Everything." Hanyan's expression shifted from concern to understanding. "You're him, aren't you? The heir they've been searching for?" He nodded, unable to deny it any longer. "I'm Wang Hanan. My family owns Jinyutang, the empire I've been working for. It's mine." The walk back to Hanyan's home was filled with revelations as Hanan recounted his recovered memories. His engagement to Liu Kaifan now took on new meaning. It wasn't just about his personal life, but about business alliances between their families that had been planned for years. The pressure to conform to these familial expectations created an overwhelming sense of entrapment. "What will you do?" Hanan finally asked as they reached her door. The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Hanan looked at her, the woman who had shown him what genuine connection felt like, then thought of the thousands of employees depending on his family's leadership, the generations of tradition embodied in Jinyutang. "I have responsibilities," he said finally. "People counting on me. A legacy I was born to continue." Hanan nodded, understanding the cultural backdrop that made personal happiness secondary to familial duty. "I know," she said simply. That night, Hanan made his decision. The next morning, he called for a car. Not a taxi, but his family's private driver whom he contacted using a number he now remembered by heart. As the luxury sedan pulled away from Hanyan's humble home, Hanan watched her figure growing smaller in the rear-view mirror. At his family's mansion, the staff greeted him with shock and joy. His mother wept as she embraced him. His father, more restrained but equally moved, demanded to know where he had been. Hanan provided a carefully edited version of events, omitting details about Hanyan and her family. Secrets have a weight all their own, and as Hanan stood in the grand ballroom of the Jinyutang estate, watching crystal chandeliers reflect light across the faces of China's elite, he felt that weight threatening to crush him. What happens when two worlds that were never meant to touch suddenly collide at the most public moment possible? The Jinyutang ballroom had been transformed into a showcase of opulence for his engagement party. Rare orchids imported from Thailand adorned every table. Champagne fountains sparkled beside ice sculptures carved to resemble intertwined dragons. The guest list read like a who's who of Beijing's business aristocracy. Banking magnates, tech billionaires, and political power brokers all gathered to celebrate the union of two of China's most prestigious families. Hanan's parents stood proudly at his side, their months of anguish now replaced with relief and joy. His mother, elegant in a custom Chanel gown, kept touching his arm, as if to reassure herself he was really there. His father, stoic but clearly emotional, had been introducing him to business associates all evening, subtly reminding everyone that the Jinyutang heir had returned to take his rightful place. "Your father has arranged for representatives from the Shanghai Exchange to meet with you tomorrow," Liu Kaifan whispered, squeezing his arm possessively. "The merger announcement will be made next week." She looked radiant in a red gown that symbolized good fortune, her family's ancient jade hairpin catching the light with every graceful movement. But Hanan's attention kept drifting to the entrance. When a commotion at the door finally announced new arrivals, his heart raced. Hanan and her mother stood hesitantly at the threshold, looking both awed and terrified by the splendor around them. They wore their Sunday best, simple but clean attire that marked them immediately as outsiders in this world of luxury. Hanan had sent his private car for them but hadn't explained who they truly were to him, the family who had saved him, housed him, and shown him kindness when he had nothing. He had only told his driver to bring special guests. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Hanan broke protocol, excusing himself mid-conversation with a government minister to personally greet the newcomers. Liu Kaifan's smile froze as she watched her fiancé embrace these strangers with genuine warmth. "You came?" Yinan said, unable to hide his relief. "We almost didn't," Hanan replied softly. Her eyes widened as she took in the surroundings. This is your real life?" Yinan guided them to a quiet corner, aware of the curious stares following them. For half an hour, he managed to keep his world separated, introducing Hanan and her mother simply as dear friends, without elaboration. He ensured they were served the finest delicacies, explaining unfamiliar dishes, translating the whispered comments of nearby guests who speculated about their identity. Across the room, Liu Xiang, a business rival who had been positioning himself to take Yinan's place during his absence, watched this interaction with growing interest. When Yinan was called away to greet important government officials, Liu Xiang approached Hanan. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked with a practiced smile. "Quite different from selling corn on the streets, isn't it?" Hanyan's shock confirmed his suspicion. Liu Xiang had recognized her from visits to the rural market where he sourced ingredients for his restaurants. With calculated timing, he waited until Yinan rejoined his parents and Liu Kaifan's family for a formal toast before making his move. "Ladies and gentlemen," Liu Xiang called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "I believe our distinguished host has forgotten to properly introduce his most interesting guests." He gestured dramatically toward Hanan and her mother. "Perhaps he's embarrassed to admit that during his mysterious absence, the heir to Jin Yu Tang was selling grilled corn alongside this young woman in a village market." The ballroom erupted in shocked gasps. Liu Kaifan's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. "Is this true?" Wang Liwei demanded, his face flushing with anger as he turned to his son. Before Yinan could respond, Liu Kaifan's grandfather, the chairman of their family conglomerate, stepped forward. "You mean to tell us that while we were negotiating a multi-billion yuan merger between our companies, you were living as a street vendor?" "He was living with them," Liu Xiang continued, relishing his moment. "A common laborer in their household. Ask them if you don't believe me." All eyes turned to Hanan and her mother, who stood frozen in the spotlight of collective scrutiny. The contrast between their modest attire and the surrounding luxury had never been more stark. "Is this the reason for your memory loss claim?" Liu Kaifan asked, her voice brittle with humiliation. "A convenient excuse to hide your double life? Our families have spent months planning this merger." Yinan moved to stand between his two worlds, his family and fiancé on one side, Hanan and her mother on the other. The tension in the room was suffocating. "Yes," he said simply. "Everything Liu Xiang said is true. I lost my memory in the accident. Hanan found me unconscious in the woods. She and her family took me in when I had nothing. No identity, no money, no past. They gave me a home when I was a stranger." His mother pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. His father stood rigid with shock. "While living with them, I learned what it means to earn every yuan through hard work. I learned how to be part of a family that values each other more than status or wealth. I learned that happiness doesn't require luxury." Liu Kaifan's father stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "This engagement is a disgrace. The contracts, the merger agreements, all premised on a lie." "Not a lie," Yinan countered. "A discovery. I am still Wang Yinan. I still understand my responsibilities to this company and our family legacy. But I'm also the man who found purpose selling corn beside Hanan." Hanan finally found her voice. "We didn't know who he was. We just knew he needed help." The simple dignity of her words silenced the room momentarily. Even the most jaded guests recognized the authenticity of the statement. Yinan turned to face the assembled elite. "My accident and memory loss gave me something priceless. The chance to see life from a different perspective, to experience genuine connection without the filter of wealth or status." He looked directly at his father. "The Wang family has always prided itself on recognizing value where others miss it. Hanan and her family have values that no amount of money can buy: compassion, integrity, and genuine community. These are qualities that should be honored, not dismissed." Liu Kaifan stepped forward, her voice cold with rage. "Choose now, Yinan, this peasant girl or your responsibilities, Your family's legacy or this fantasy of simple living you've been playing at. The room held its collective breath. Hanan looked from his parents to Han Yan, understanding that his next words would permanently alter the course of many lives. I choose both, he said firmly. I am the heir to Jinyu Tang, and I will honor that legacy. But I will do it as the man I've become, someone who understands both worlds and can bridge them. The engagement can proceed if that's what our families still want, but only with complete honesty about who I am and what I've learned. He reached for Han Yan's hand, and this woman and her family will always have my loyalty and gratitude. They will be respected guests in my home and valued advisors in my life. The silence that followed was electric. Two worlds stood facing each other across an impossible divide, with Hanan positioned at the crossing point. As the tension stretched between those two worlds, Hanan stood at a crossroads few ever encounter, where wealth meets wisdom and privilege confronts purpose. Most people believe that climbing the social ladder means abandoning your roots. But what if the heir to an empire had discovered that true success requires something most billionaires never achieve? The silence in the elegant ballroom gradually transformed from shock to curiosity. Hanan stepped forward, his posture reflecting both the confidence of a corporate heir and the humility of a man who had sold corn on village streets. I'm not choosing between these worlds, he announced, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. I'm proposing we bring them together. The gasps from both sides of the room couldn't have been more synchronized if they had been rehearsed. Wang Liwei, Hanan's father, stepped forward with furrowed brows. Son, you cannot seriously suggest bringing street vendors into our corporate structure. The board would never. Not as street vendors, father, Hanan interrupted, pulling out a folder he'd prepared. As artisans, as keepers of tradition that our customers value more than we've realized. Hanan's bold proposal was revolutionary, creating a new division at Jinyu Tang that would employ local artisans from Han Yan's village and surrounding communities. Their traditional craftsmanship would enhance Jinyu Tang's luxury offerings, creating unique heritage-infused products that would appeal to consumers seeking authenticity. The resistance was immediate and came from all sides. The Wang family's concerns centered primarily on their reputation among Beijing's elite. Hanan's mother pulled him aside during a tense moment. We've spent generations building this name, she whispered. You want to risk it all for what? A village girl? On the other side of the room, Han Yan's parents huddled together, their expressions a mixture of pride and terror. Her father leaned toward Hanan when he approached them. Our daughter doesn't belong in that world, he said, gesturing toward the crystal chandeliers and marble floors. They'll eat her alive. The days that followed brought escalating pressure. Liu Kaifan's family issued what amounted to a corporate ultimatum through their representatives. Either Hanan would proceed with the arranged marriage as planned, securing the strategic alliance between their families, or they would withdraw from all existing partnerships with Jinyu Tang. The Liu family's distribution network handles 40% of our export business, Hanan's father reminded him during a private dinner. Their banking connections finance our expansion projects. This isn't a game, son. Hanan placed his chopsticks down carefully. I learned something during those months when I couldn't remember who I was, he said quietly. When you have nothing, no name, no status, no wealth, you discover what actually matters. His parents exchanged glances across the table as Hanan continued. I saw people with so little share everything they had. I experienced genuine community. Not networking, not strategic alliances, but real human connection. The villagers support each other without calculating what they'll get in return. Hanan pulled out his phone and showed them photographs of the village, of Han Yan's family's small home, of the market where he'd sold corn. Look at their craftsmanship, he said, displaying images of intricately carved wooden utensils, woven baskets with patterns passed down through generations, and textiles with designs unique to the region. These skills are disappearing because there's no economic path forward for them. But our customers are increasingly seeking authenticity and connection to tradition. His father's expression softened slightly as he examined the photos. You want to preserve these traditions while making Jinyu Tang stronger? Hanan nodded. These aren't just crafts. They're our cultural heritage, and they're valuable. The market research I've been conducting shows that luxury consumers are willing to pay premium prices for products with authentic stories and traditional craftsmanship. Meanwhile, Hanan struggled with her own doubts about entering Yinan's world. Each time she visited the Jinyutang offices, she felt the stares from employees, the whispers behind cupped hands. "I don't know how to be the person they expect," she admitted to Yinan as they walked through a corporate garden. "I don't know which fork to use at dinner, or how to talk about investments." Yinan took her hand. "They don't expect you to be anyone but yourself. That's what I love about you, your authenticity. Besides," he smiled, "I didn't know how to grill corn when I started, but you taught me." As the critical board meeting approached, the pressure reached its breaking point. Yinan spent nights preparing his presentation, knowing that both his personal happiness and the future of hundreds of village craftspeople hung in the balance. "You're not just proposing a business model," Hanan told him the night before the meeting. "You're asking them to see value in people they've spent their lives overlooking." The boardroom of Jinyutang exuded power. 12 executives with a combined centuries of experience in the luxury market sat around a table that predated the founding of modern China. Yinan stood before them, acutely aware of the weight of tradition pressing down on his shoulders. "Distinguished members of the board," he began, "today I'm proposing not just a new division, but a new direction." For the next hour, Yinan presented his vision with passion and precision. He showed market research demonstrating the growing consumer demand for authentic craftsmanship. He displayed prototypes of wine packaging incorporating traditional wood carving techniques from Hanyan's village. He outlined a training program that would preserve disappearing craft traditions while creating sustainable livelihoods. "The essence of luxury isn't just exclusivity," he concluded. "It's meaning, it's craftsmanship, it's the human touch that can't be mass-produced. By integrating traditional artisans into our production, we aren't just helping their communities, we're enhancing our brand's value and appeal." The questions came rapid fire, probing every aspect of his proposal. The CFO questioned the profit margins. The marketing director worried about brand dilution. The head of production expressed concerns about quality control. Yinan answered each question with calm confidence, until Liu Kaifen's grandfather, the chairman, raised his hand for silence. "Young Wang," the octogenarian said, leaning forward on his cane, "you want us to believe that these village craftspeople can create products worthy of the Jinyutang name?" "With respect, Chairman Liu," Yinan replied, opening a lacquered box he had brought with him. "They already have." Inside was a wine presentation set, a hand-carved wooden tray incorporating the Jinyutang logo, a pair of cups with intricate designs telling the story of winemaking, and a serving vessel that combined traditional carving with modern functionality. The craftsmanship was exquisite. "This was created by artisans from Hanyan's village in less than a week," Yinan explained. "Imagine what they could do with proper resources and training." A hush fell over the room as the box was passed around. When it reached Chairman Liu, the old man examined it with expert eyes, running his fingers over the detailed carving. "My grandfather," he said finally, "sold wine from a cart not unlike the corn stall you mentioned. He knew every customer by name." He set the box down carefully. "We've grown so large that sometimes we forget where we came from." The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Yinan's proposal was approved with modifications and a 6-month trial period. The investment would be limited initially, with clear performance metrics established. 3 weeks later, Yinan stood in the familiar woods where Hanan had found him months ago. The spring air carried the scent of new growth, and beside him, Hanan pointed to the exact spot where she had discovered him unconscious. "It feels like another lifetime," she said. Yinan nodded, taking in the simple beauty of the forest. In many ways, it was. He knelt down and touched the earth where his old life had ended, and his new understanding had begun. "I came here to show you something," he said, pulling out architectural renderings from his briefcase. The plans showed a beautiful but modest building, a training center and workshop designed to blend with the natural surroundings, located at the edge of the village. "The Jinyutang Heritage Crafts Division," he explained. "Construction begins next month. You'll be the director of artisan development." Hanyan's eyes widened as she studied the plans. This changes everything for the village. Hanan took her hand, his eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Some people think success means having to choose between worlds, but sometimes the most powerful choice is refusing to choose, finding a way to honor both. Hanan's journey reveals a profound truth about identity. Sometimes we must lose ourselves completely to discover who we truly are. In the chaos of amnesia, stripped of status and wealth, he found something that even his billion-dollar empire couldn't provide: authentic connection and purpose. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the dramatic contrast between selling corn in a village market and running a luxury empire. It's that through his transformation, Hanan discovered that our identities aren't defined by the possessions we accumulate or the positions we hold, but by the relationships we nurture and the lives we touch. As one philosopher notes, true happiness is often found in unexpected places, away from material wealth and social status. Hanan's experience teaches us that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't a family fortune or corporate legacy, but the wisdom to recognize genuine fulfillment when we find it, even if it comes wrapped in the humble package of a corn seller's stall, rather than the polished boardrooms of power. Perhaps we all need moments where our carefully constructed identities are stripped away, leaving only our essential selves. In that vulnerability, we might discover what Hanan did, that a life worth living isn't measured by what we own, but by who we love and how deeply we connect.